48, what happened now, what happened before 48, what's happening now. And I say this because there's a very concentrated bias campaign. This is the case across conflicts or wars, occupations across the world. There are a lot of lobbies. And so when you're having debates, when you're having discussion, when you're building awareness, you yourself need to know what's happening. It's really easy. I'm not actually going to shame anyone for using infographics. I think they're a great primer on something, but you need to take the time to understand what is occupation, what is genocide, what is ethnic cleansing, what are the different areas. We're going to discuss this, but just some of the things I would challenge you to do so. And when I said non-Palestinians in particular, I think when we're talking about Palestine, it's so emotionally charged, understandably so, for Palestinians. And it's a shame that we force them to constantly defend or explain their humanity and why they deserve rights or their land in every part of their existence. They understand, whether Palestinians have the language or not, they understand occupation to their core because them and their families are experiencing it. And I think it's on us as non-Palestinians to understand it better and take some of that burden off of, take the onus, take some of that burden off of them. It is not fair to me for Palestinians to have to explain why they deserve to have their homes or why they deserve to have healthcare, why they deserve to get paid fairly, in all parts of life. And I think there are a lot of opportunities that we have as non-Palestinians, especially if we consider ourselves allies, we want to be allies, to kind of take that role in these spaces. And with that, let me pull up one slide and let Jenna talk to you about some key terms. Okay. Hopefully it pulls up. There we go.
Where is it? All right, can you guys see it?
No, give me one sec. I'm out the game here. I used to be a TA and have to share my screen all the time. All right. There we go.
Okay. So speaking of infographics, that's where I pulled some of these things from. And so Haroun's absolutely correct. Sometimes it's the easiest way to disseminate information. It's important to know, obviously, how to use the infographics, but these are good primers. And so on the left side, you'll see on the red part where it says words not to use. PLM stands for Palestinian Lives Matter. I wanted to start there because I think it's very important to not co-opt other processes and to not co-opt other resistance movements. We all know that Black Lives Matter is the term that is used for Black liberation. And so any iteration of that is not ours to use. And I understand why some people feel as though it makes a point because it's already within the collective conscience. But it's very, very important to not co-opt the struggles of other marginalized groups. We can coalition build without taking over. So that's the first. We don't want to use words like eviction. I know that word has been used consistently throughout what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah. And I think it's because it's the easiest thing that people can associate with something that they already understand. But eviction denotes a certain legality, it denotes a certain level of legitimacy. It denotes a certain a lack of violence in the same, obviously homelessness is violence within itself, but it denotes a different type of lack of violence in a way that a forced expulsion doesn't, it's not the same thing. Conflicts, you'll see conflict, war, clash, both sides. Those four terms kind of follow within the same rhetoric where they put the onus on two equally charged individuals or two equally capable individuals. Conflict, war, clash, both sides, those terms are used in order to legitimize the state of Israel and its actions against Palestinian civilians. Palestinians do not have an army, they do not have a navy, they do not have forces in the same way that the Israeli, and I'm going to say Israeli occupying forces, not the Israeli defense forces, because again, that's another way of using your language in order to know exactly what you're trying to say. But words you can use instead of that are apartheid, colonialism, state-sanctioned violence, ethnic cleansing, boycotting Israel, ending the occupation, illegal settlements, anti-Zionism. Those are terms that mean exactly what is happening. War or conflict or clash, those terms can be very broad and they're not specific in nature to what is occurring. Also making sure when you're talking about the issue of Palestine to use the word Palestine or use the word Palestinian and not to use the word Arab. There's a huge campaign against ensuring that this is part of a larger Arab-Israeli conflict that is attempting to minimize the Palestinian identity. It's not to say, I mean, I'm a Palestinian, I would consider myself an Arab, but within this context, we're not using the word Arab because it completely wipes over the Palestinian population who lives there. I personally don't use the word Israeli citizens because I believe in Israeli settlers as a concept, because anyone who moved into this area for the purpose of displacing the original population is a settler, not a citizen. Ethnic cleansing as opposed to evictions again. Settler colonial terrorism, that's a very specific term. It's a very, very specific term. And I think the importance of it can't be understated or can't be overstated. Settler colonialism is a form of colonization that seeks to replace the native population of the colonized land with a new society of settlers. It's a very different thing than immigration. It's a very different thing than just moving to a place. It's a very, very different concept. And so knowing that is very important. And then of course, you know, when we talk about Jerusalem, we talk about it as the capital of Palestine. So those are the words that I think it's important to get familiar with the terminology. If you're not familiar with the terminology, you can get trapped into a debate that you don't want to defend how it's a war when there is one side that's being indiscriminately eviscerated. You don't want to start defending a both sides conversation when there are no both sides to, you know, what's right and what's wrong. Like, we don't have these types of both sides arguments. So it's important to use proper language so you don't get stuck having a conversation about minutia or having a conversation about something that doesn't actually apply.
Sorry, I'm looking to see if there's any questions. So this next section we're going to talk about is kind of occupation and the current events that are happening. I'm going to talk briefly about occupation. Actually, we'll talk about it both because I think we both have examples from on the ground, from things we've read. But similar, or kind of building off what Jenna had said about the usage of terminology, a lot of times we use the term occupation only as like a geographic designation or occupied territories, and we ignore the fact that it is a violent act, like to take someone's land. It is really focused on whittling away someone's power, taking away their land, and then depriving them of their basic human rights. And that is what occupation is. It is not just a part of the map, which I will show the map. It is not just that. It is a violent, pervasive, ongoing act of violence. And that is the way you need to see occupation. And similar to what Jenna was saying about when we talk about conflict in both sides, a lot of the rhetoric that, if any of us are on Twitter, we've seen what the Israeli Twitter account and a lot of these accounts are saying, but this has been going on for decades upon decades. You know, other individuals will express sympathy for Palestinians. They will use terminology like their side. But what we're ignoring a lot of times is the fact that it's not a level playing field. Like, this is between an occupier and then the suppressed, repressed, occupied. It is not about two equal nations or military mights. It is truly oppressors versus the oppressed.
And that's the thing, we understand the concept of power imbalances in all other scenarios. You understand a power imbalance between a professor and a student. You understand a power imbalance between your boss and your coworkers. You understand power imbalances even between like parents and children. We understand the concept of power imbalances, and you have to look at the issue of Palestine, what's occurring as a strict power imbalance. And when you have power imbalances, there's a duty of those in power and how they're supposed to deal with the people that they're reside power over. Yeah. And even in terms of international law, and we can discuss that in another capacity as well, but even international law forces an occupying force. Even though we consider an occupying force illegal under international law, we still have frameworks in which occupying forces have to deal with those whom they occupy.
Yeah. So I'm looking at my phone just because I just want to make sure that certain facts and figures I state correctly. But I do want to talk really briefly before I talk about specific examples of what occupation looks and feels like, is the fact that not only is it about how sovereignty is taken, land is taken, We're also talking about how political leaders are co-opted and compromised and act as servants of an occupying power. We are talking about how occupiers exploit violent resistance. And I mean, you can use the word violent, but we are talking about resistance and freedom fighting and liberation. It is exploited and even provoked to legitimize occupation. And I say that, and I want you to think about the last 2 weeks. And you want to look at Gaza and the way that we talk about people that are currently facing an ongoing genocide and the way that they're spoken about and their fight to live, like literally fight to live or will to live. We are talking about how occupiers exploit violent how they provoke tensions between different individuals, groups, political parties within an oppressed or occupied people. And that's no more potent or seen in Fatah and Hamas and stuff like that. We're talking about the language and how occupiers utilize things like political stability and economic growth and stability, when in actuality, again, we are talking about repression and violence. I say all of this, I will pull up the map so everyone gets a better sense. But before I do so, and me and Jenna will just kind of speak to this, I said that occupation is pervasive, and that was very intentional in the sense of it is not just about having land taken. That alone is horrible, but we are talking about the fact that these are individuals who are having every part of their life disrupted, or I'll use the word disrupted. I don't think it's a fair enough word. What's a better term? Stolen. Say it again. Stolen. Yeah. Having every part.
Then also co-opted too.
Yeah.
Like parts of the Palestinian identity. I mean, in order to effectively and fully take over a nation or take over a people, you need to be pervasive. You start with taking land, but then you start by changing narrative. You start by enforcing history. You start by changing the street names so they do not denote the initial names of those areas. You start by making sure that food is not associated with any particular group anymore. You start by co-opting the language and start inserting things like that. Palestinians in Palestine don't use the Arabic word for checkpoint. They use the word mahsoum, and that is a Ibri word. That is a Hebrew word. You start by making sure that the cultural dances are now, so fully intertwined. You start by making sure that the Palestinian hatta and kufiya, there's an Israeli equivalent. You do all of these things in order to ensure that at every single level, there's no trace left of the ethnic population.
And like Jenna, so when we talk a lot about occupation, there are certain things that everyone is more familiar or aware about. So we talk about the apartheid wall, we talk about checkpoints, and specifically like in the West Bank, there are at least 590 checkpoints. And we'll look at the map. And if anyone is familiar with the geography of Palestine, it's not big. 593 is a lot of checkpoints for such a small area. We're familiar more with kind of what's happening in Jerusalem, specifically Aqsa. People are a little bit more familiar with Sheikh Jarrah right now. But occupation presents itself in so many different ways. And I figured me and Jen could give a few examples. So when we talk about, electricity, we are talking about the fact that in the West Bank, Palestinian homes, businesses have limited electricity for certain portions of the day, as opposed to settlements that are within a mile. They have no limit. And again, that might be something that you're aware of, but it's even more dangerous than that. We talk about how Tel Aviv is the Silicon Valley of the Middle East. And then at the same time, like we're talking about Ramallah and the West Bank, and Palestinians are some of the most educated people in the world. But what's not spoken about is that data usage, Wi-Fi access, internet access is limited, and not just for limiting information spreading or sharing. It's so that you can't build or develop certain technologies, apps. Like you are stunting the growth of their entire, not only like technology or startup market, but also just like their ability to like create. When we talk about water, we usually talk about the fact that like water is limited to Palestinian homes versus Israeli settler homes. I think one of the most jarring things of when I was in the West Bank, and Jen is familiar with this, is I will never forget Palestinians telling me like, oh, if it's a flat roofed house, it is a Palestinian home. And if you see the triangular roof, that is an Israeli home. And you know how you know is because or the reason for this is that there are water containers on the top of these flat roofs so that they can collect rainwater just in case their water is turned off for them. And at the same time, a lot of times when they're trying to quell tensions or provoke Palestinians, they will throw, what is it called, skunk
water.
Yeah, to contaminate people's water,
which is
on their
essentially
roof.
sewage water that has been like repurposed in order to spray at Palestinians.
But like those are things that people are a little bit more familiar with water. But again, it's even deeper than that. When we talk about like groundwater, fresh groundwater, we're talking about aquifers and things that are between, not only in like 1948 Israel proper, in Gaza, and a lot of which is in the West Bank. We are talking about the fact that there's a reason why certain parts of the West Bank are being eyed for annexation, and it is where a lot of the fresh water exists in that region. All of which will be given to Israeli citizens and will not be given to Palestinian citizens. It is like, they are, when we say occupation and control, it is not just what is at ground level, it is what is below the ground, it is what is above the ground, it is what's surrounding the land. And so other things, I'm gonna pull up the map, but I just wanted to share a few things. And like in regards to occupation, and Jana, I know she'll have a lot more to share about this, is when we talk about, I'm very familiar with labor, but when we talk about labor and people passing through checkpoints to maybe work in, 1948 Israel proper, we're talking, they are not afforded the same labor laws, regulations, and rights that Israeli citizens are offered. When we talk about, the prison system, like throughout the West Bank, there are raids, there's illegal detention. There's so much practice of transferring Palestinians from the West Bank illegally to prisons in Israel, which is against international law, and they're held almost indefinitely, where they don't go before a court. Jenny, I think.
Well, I was going to say the point, and this is an important point to note too, is that Palestinians and Israelis face two different judicial systems, completely two different judicial systems, and Palestinian children are not afforded the right to not be tried as adults. And so Palestinian children are tried as adults within Israeli courts, and Palestinians have a 99% conviction rate. So even when we talk about like judicial systems, and you talk about, being able to take your right to court, like I'm an attorney. And so, I know what it takes, and, the presumption of innocence and guilt, and how we try to prove crimes, and how we can defend ourselves, and all of these types of things. When you have a system that is stacked against you by its very nature, is created to be stacked against you, there's no real justice either within or without the court systems.
And so I'm gonna pull up the map, but the reason we're sharing this is because it's kind of what the point we're trying to drive home. Like, you must take a moment to learn what is happening, and there's so many ways to do so in terms of learning this. And it's because it's not as simple as we've all been led to understand or assume. Like, it is so much deeper. It's so much more, I keep using the word pervasive. It is every part of Palestinian life, freedom, and like humanity. I'm going to pull up this map really quickly because I just also want to give people a sense of kind of the West Bank, and this will be a minute. Sorry. Give me one sec. All right. Let's see. Can you see?
Yeah, it's a good map.
All right. So one, I just wanted to, there we go. The map on the left is just Palestine, Israel right now. I just wanted to give people a sense of like where the cities and things are located. And Jenna, you can kind of speak to this. Like, these cities are extremely close to one another. Like, how close would you say, if there were no checkpoints in between, how close do you think Jerusalem and Ramallah, which is like the hub of Palestinian life, is?
Not even 15 minutes. Like, not even.
Yeah. And it can take, I've traveled it. I think it took us like 2 hours to do so, just because we were stopped at checkpoint after checkpoint. But on the left, you'll see the map. I just want to give people a sense of like that, the light green closest to Egypt is Gaza. On the right, where you see the light green, that's the West Bank. And then 1948 borders or Israel is kind of like that, I don't know, color, like teal maybe is the color we'll use. But I wanted to take a moment just to give you guys an insight of like to kind of add color to what we were just talking about in terms of water, checkpoints, settlements in the West Bank. So in terms of the West Bank, there are 3 areas. A and B, Palestinians have some sort of civil control or authority over. They don't, it's still under military control of Israel. And I think they still face Israeli military courts throughout the entire West Bank. But A and B are the white striped areas, as you're seeing, and then the red is all area C, which Israel has full control over. And
I think this is actually a super important map, because a lot of the times when people talk about Palestine or Palestinian territories or the occupied territories, they're thinking that the West Bank is a contiguous area, that there's no separation between them. And what you don't realize is, while you're looking at this map, is that in order to fully control a population, you need to surround it. Right. And so it kind of looks like a piece of Swiss cheese. What you put settlements in between Palestinian areas, you make sure that the roads aren't easily accessible between Palestinian cities to Palestinian cities. You make sure that you separate families. And that's exactly what this map is showing.
And like the population numbers are specific to Area C. That's not the West Bank has at least, I think in total, around 3 million people. I think 2.1 or 2 is probably Palestinian, maybe a little more. But it's important to just see that, like she said, the West Bank is not continuous. It's being broken up. Control is being broken up, and Israel does control most of the West Bank, in addition to the rest of the entire nation. And it's also very specific where more of the rural areas where the natural resources are fully under Israeli control. But settlements exist in parts of areas B as well, I believe A and B. And kind of what Jenna was saying, you're not only splitting off families, you're not even having Palestinian roads, you're making, we said 590 at least checkpoints. You're not just making it difficult, you're limiting a lot of growth of an already, stifled population. So she'll talk about Sheikh Jarrah, but we talk about ethnic cleansing and changing the demographics of neighborhoods or areas, specifically Jerusalem. Hebron has been victim to this like none other in the world, probably. Except for the Armenian population and other Kurdish populations. But the Israeli government is incentivizing Israeli settlers to move to the West Bank with money, resources, land. And it's not just to change the demographics of a place like Hebron, it's to stifle the growth of a city like Ramallah. So in Ramallah, when you're there and you look up into the hills, they have settlements all around the city. A lot of those homes are empty, but the thing about it is, not only have you created a process in which construction requires approval of certain courts and institutions, but you have limited the growth of these people horizontally. You are only allowing them to build vertically, and you are putting them at risk. And I just want you to just take a moment to just see how stifled this population is. And so when people also say, I think it was more in the news when Trump was president, where they had said or Netanyahu was saying they're already beginning to eye Area C of the West Bank. It's not just you would assume when you're hearing that in the news, it's just this little corner, but it is the majority of the West Bank that they're considering annexing. I will stop talking about this and let Jenna speak. But
no, you're fine. I think that it's important to talk about what life looks like on the ground too. So Haroun, for example, brought up Hebron, Al-Khalil. And Hebron, aside from being a very important trade post, because a lot of the trade, Hebron is known to be a city of merchants. And aside from the fact that it was where the majority of trade happened between Hebron and Jerusalem, to the point that their accents literally sound very similar at this point. One's a little bit more elongated, but it shows that there used to be a time period in which people were traveling freely, as you would, from Columbus to Cincinnati, or if you were going from Columbus to Cleveland. These things it was very, very common for people to engage with one another in these areas. But Hebron is one of those areas that is, I would objectively say, as far as the West Bank, is under the most violent aspect of the settler colonial project. Hebron is where Israeli settlers are allowed to hold guns. It's not the police and it's not the army, it's the settlers themselves. Palestinians are not allowed to own any firearms, any weaponry, any of those types of things. And so the way that Hebron is kind of built out, if you think of a donut, right? And there's an outside of the donut and the inside hole of a donut where there's nothing. So that's H1, or H1 is the donut hole, and then H2 is the outside area. Now, there used to be like the entire of Hebron was Palestinian, and they've slowly put settlers in the H2 area to close and like to stifle the Palestinians within H1. And so there's not many Palestinians left within the H2 area, and the Palestinians are fully surrounded. Hebron is where not only do settlers frequently attack, it's also where the most extremist of the Israeli population tends to move. It's where if Palestinians close their shops down for any longer than 3 days, their doors are welded shut and they're not allowed to return to their shops. It's where people are so terrified to live that there's been en masse people from Al-Khalil who have left Palestine, or who have left Al-Khalil and moved to other areas of Palestine, that the Palestinian Authority has been attempting to offer stipends essentially for Palestinians to move to Al-Khalil, but it's so dangerous, no one wants to go. Al-Khalil is also where the Masjid al-Ibrahimi, which is the Abrahamic mosque, where Prophet Abraham and his son Ishaq, and his wife Sarah are buried. And that mosque, which used to be Muslim run, has now 75% of it has been taken by the Israeli settlers and is now controlled by that population as a result of a massacre that occurred by an American Jew who was visiting that area and completely shot up the area. And then they ended up giving Israel 75% of that mosque. So even to the point that the Metdane, which is, most people like see them on the top of mosque where the minaret, where the imam of a mosque would go up to give the adhan to call for prayer, is on the Israeli side of the mosque. And so in order to give the call to prayer, the Palestinian imam needs to seek permission to go onto that side of the mosque in order to give the adhan. These types of things are intended to break the spirit of the population. How humiliating is it in order to call to prayer 5 times a day that you have to ask your occupying force if you are allowed to do so? And if you do not hear the adhan in the Khalil for one of the prayers, it's because that individual wasn't allowed to do so.
I'm just going to add really quick. It was like, not because of the people or the land itself, like it was one of the worst experiences of my entire life to visit Hebron, just because it was so hard to be there. And just a few comments to add on. When we talk about what happened in New Zealand, I think it was like 2 years ago, Christchurch, it's so similar to what this settler did. He went during Jummah, he locked the door and he massacred, worshipers. And then afterwards, when investigations were going, when cleaning was going, when the Israeli government decided that they were going to take control of like this tragedy, it was reopened, I think, a week later. And they were just informed that, by the way, 2/3 to 3/4 of this masjid is now a synagogue. They put checkpoints right outside the masjid to make it difficult for Palestinians to go to the masjid, which was a hub. It's right near, and right nearby to go. It's like a 4 or 5 minute walk to like the old city, like kind of like the high street of like this area. You have to go through multiple checkpoints, and it is an Israeli only road. I still remember I was within 25 or 30 feet to me, and a Palestinian passerby was like, "Do not go there." And lo and behold, within a minute, a random tank came by and said, "What are you doing on the street? You don't belong here." And I'm like, what? But I'll add one thing. One of the saddest things is when you go into the masjid, there are plastic tarps all by the door. And it is because, I'll add 2 things. It is because Israeli settlers will walk and purposefully get their shoes muddy and walk through the musalla. Number 2, a lot of the Israeli settlers have the homes above shops or have taken the top level of homes, and they project fire and have speaker systems that like have bomb and like artillery noises that they play on the masjid during prayer to scare people who are walking or while they're praying.
Right. And so Al-Khalil, if you do any research on Hebron, it is, I think, the best sense that you can get of top to bottom occupation and what it feels like to be a Palestinian in the worst area. I'm from Al-Khalil. We're not allowed to return. The comment is correct. They also do throw trash on the Palestinians regularly, and therefore Palestinians walking through the old city have constructed gates above themselves in order to stop the projectile of trash onto them. You'll see literally lawn chairs and anything that needs to be dumped is getting dumped on top of Palestinians. So yeah, Hebron is a really almost like a case study. I hate to say it like that, but it's almost like worth looking very deeply into Hebron, into how Palestinians live in Hebron, because it is the place where there is unchecked power by both Israeli settlers and the IDF. And yeah, and it's openly permitted. And so we have also, like, you know, Shara al-Shuhada is what Haroun was talking about, which is the street. It's called Martyr Street in English. And it used to be where all the gold shops were. And again, like I said, Khalil was an area that was very, it was where trade was happening. So people would go there to sell their gold and to make their gold and do all of these types of things. There's also an Armenian quarter in El Khalil. And that street has completely been shut down and is Israeli only. And there's roads in the Khalil that Palestinians are allowed to walk on, but they're not allowed to drive on, and Israelis are allowed to drive on. And so again, it's about making sure that the daily life is so unlivable that people either like do everything they can to leave, or you're, you know, sitting there suffering. But we're getting close on time, so I want to focus in on Sheikh Jarrah and Gaza. So I know you guys have seen it. I'm assuming in the news lately, that's where a lot of the current news cycle has been focusing itself. So Sheikh Jarrah is an issue of 8 Palestinian families that are facing forced expulsion from their homes. Israel has laws that dictate that Jews may return to land that they lost in the 1948 war. So again, when we're talking in terms of long and pervasive histories, the 1948 war was now 73 years ago. And there are claims that there were families who were living there and who were forced and who left or fled. And so they have rights to lands that Palestinians have now been living in for over 70 years. And so again, it's attempting to manipulate the legal system. And so that's why you'll hear people talk in terms of, well, this is just a legal dispute. Like people have, you know, they're attaching a term of ethnic cleansing on something that's just a legal dispute. Well, it's not a legal dispute when the laws themselves don't make sense. And it's not a legal dispute when the laws themselves are constructed in a way to attempt to ensure that Palestinians do not have rights. The Sheikh Jarrah families have been there for decades, but they had already previously been displaced from other areas of Palestine. Nahlat Shimon International is a settler company, and they filed lawsuits to seize these homes and transfer them to settler groups. And the goal essentially is a unified Jerusalem, because a Jewish Jerusalem offers legitimacy to the state of Israel. So when we, you know, a lot of people didn't understand the move of Trump moving the American consulate to Israel and allowing Israel to declare Jerusalem as its capital. The importance of that is because with Jerusalem, you have East and West Jerusalem. It is completely illegal under international law for the Israeli state to have a presence in East Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is supposed to be open territory. Jerusalem is not supposed to belong to any one state. And every political leader in the United States prior to Trump understood the importance of keeping essentially hands off Jerusalem, because that it's not a US designation in order to decide whose capital it is or who it isn't. So in order to make Jerusalem as Israeli as possible, you have to make it as Jewish as possible. And that means to remove the Palestinian families who have been in that area. So that's Sheikh Jarrah. It's not an eviction. It's not a matter of evicting people. It's a matter of forcibly displacing them and removing families who have been there. We have, you know, there's a Vice documentary on Mona and Mohammed al-Qud's family, and they've been really amazing resources throughout this entire process that we've been seeing. But essentially what's been happening in Sheikh Jarrah for over 15 years now is coming to a head because they're attempting to forcibly expel Palestinians from their homes in order to give them to settlers, in order to establish a more Jewish presence in that neighborhood, and then long-term in order to create a more legitimate claim to, if there's no Palestinians left in Jerusalem, then Jerusalem is unequivocally the capital of Israel. And if Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, what else left is there? Like everything else comes a little bit easier. Jerusalem is the last stronghold of that area. And obviously it matters to Muslimin, it matters to non-Muslims, it matters to Palestinians in particular, but it's a very important thing that you cannot underestimate the power of Jerusalem in the general consciousness of Palestinians, and especially Muslims outside of Palestine. But this isn't new. So that's the thing that we keep saying here, that this isn't a new process. The Nakba that occurred in 1948 displaced over 750,000 Palestinians from their homes. That happened 73 3 years ago. But it's also important to note that in the 30s and in the 40s, before the Nakba, there had been a concerted effort by the British, because they had a mandate over Palestine, to slowly move Jewish populations into Palestine. This has been a long, like, it's a slow burn. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, it's a slow burn. And so of that 750,000 Palestinians who were kicked out between 1947 and 1949, there was also a dissemination of over 600 Palestinian villages. In order to change in order to change the reality on the ground, you have to change the population. You have to switch out to the population. You have to change the street signs. You have to do all of these things in order to change it. Now, what was happening in Sheikh Jarrah was not isolated, obviously, because what happens in Palestine is never isolated. It started being, there were protests, and then there started to be concerted attacks on the Aqsa Mosque compound, which is one of the holiest sites in the Muslim corpus, or the Muslim understanding, the Muslim faith. Gaza, like what the map that Haroun showed, is completely cut off from the rest of the West Bank. Gaza has been under illegal military occupation since 2007. Now, what that illegal occupation looks like, it's a total land, air, and sea siege. Gaza used to be I think it's really very hard. I think a lot of the people I'm assuming here are a little bit younger. It's very hard to imagine a world in which Gaza was an oasis. And that's the reality of the situation. People used to go to Gaza because it was a beach city. It was a beach town. It was beautiful. Like, the majority of the population made their money off of fishing. Now, Ghazawis, the people who live there, aside from the fact that they were displaced, are not able to go past a certain mile mark in the waters, or they are risking being shot dead. It's a complete siege all around, air, land, and sea. And you can't leave Gaza. So what used to be an oasis has now turned into the world's largest open-air prison. The population of Gaza is over 2 million people, half of which are under the age of 18. Gaza is a strip of land that's about 25 miles long and 7 miles wide at the widest point. So the smallest, widest point of Gaza is between 4 and 7 miles long. There's no entry or exit. You cannot leave. Egypt's border is on one side and Israel's is on the other. There's absolutely no way of getting out. And in the past decade, they've been subject to 4 massacres in what you would consider quantifying as massacre, which is a little bit concerning for me to say in general, because Gaza is always on the receiving end of an onslaught. It's very, very easy to, what we were saying early on, because Gaza is under Hamas rule. It's very easy to both sides arguments like this by saying, if Hamas weren't doing this, then Israel wouldn't respond. Or if Hamas weren't firing rockets, then Israel wouldn't have to kill 200 plus people within the span of 11 days. I hope you are understanding from the tone of this conversation and what we have been saying is that those aren't legitimate arguments. They seem like legitimate arguments because you see rocket fire and you see rocket fire. But when you start delving into the violence of the occupation, you start delving into the timelines of when these things have started happening, when you start delving into the fact that this is over 70 years of violent displacement, then things start to fall flat a little bit about these both sides arguments. Hamas was formed in 1987. Israel was formed in 1948. We know under international law that an occupied people have the right to resist their occupiers by any means necessary. I'm just asking you to think a little bit deeper about the arguments that are made when it comes to blaming Palestinians for their own annihilation, or blaming Palestinians for their own genocide, essentially. And it's not a religious conflict in that same way too, because Zionism within its inception was not a religious project. It was a completely secular one. If you read the readings of Theodor Herzl and those who preceded him, it wasn't a matter of trying to find religious significance to the land in the same way. I mean, Palestine, or like the relocation of Jews from Eastern Europe into Palestine, was also considered either, they were considering within the Zionist project, because again, this was happening in the late 1800s before there was even in Israel. It was like 1897, I believe, that the original Zionist conference occurred. And they were considering Uganda, they were considering Argentina, and they were considering Palestine as places to place people in order to create an Israeli state. And it started shifting in terms of marketing. It was like, okay, well, Uganda doesn't really make sense, and Argentina doesn't really make sense, but Palestine, like we can find importance there in tying all these things together. And yeah, it's essentially, we're fighting a war against misinformation. And it's not a war between Israel and Palestine, because a war, again, denotes two equal populations that can actually fight each other equally. We're fighting the war against misinformation. Don't let anyone tell you that what's happening in Palestine started only 73 years ago. This is a long-term colonial project that started in the 1800s. And you have a duty as an individual here who cares about this, who's sitting here on a Saturday or a Sunday afternoon listening to Haroun and I talk for 45 minutes. You have a duty to inform yourself and don't get caught in the wrong debate. That's the problem. And don't get caught debating. I mean, I used to do this all the time. I was an undergrad and I fought with people who I knew didn't even think I had a right to exist. Like, what? There's no point in that. You have a platform right now and you should be using it to inform people of facts, because honestly, once you face people with the truth and once you face people with things as clearly as possible, it's very, very hard, unless you're actively attempting to advocate for genocide, to be on the wrong side of this. It's very difficult.
And do not forget, this is ongoing, even if it's not on the news. Like, people in Sheikh Jarrah are in the process of being displaced right now violently. But there are so many other people that this is happening to who are being pushed to this brink, who it already has happened to and it will happen to. What's happening in Gaza, this blockade has been ongoing, but before the blockade, they were also being oppressed or repressed. So just keep in mind, like, this isn't an issue or event-based, violence. This is ongoing. We're going to take a moment. We ran a little over, so we will stay on for Q&A after this next section, but we're going to talk briefly about, do you want to do coalition building and then I'll do action items?
Absolutely. Okay. So you've sat here, you've listened, what's next really? And that's why I think it's important that I'm really, really thankful for the MSA and the SJP for putting this event on together, because this is step one. So the MSA is the Muslim Student Association, SJP is Students for Justice in Palestine. I think a lot of the times there's confusion about the fact that, because MSA is a Muslim organization and SJP is a non-religious organization, the spillover must be because, Muslims care about Palestine, therefore whatever. I hear about this a lot with people saying like, Palestine's not a Muslim issue. It is a Muslim issue. And you know why it's a Muslim issue? Because Muslims care about humanitarian issues. And also because Muslims care about Palestine. You cannot separate the two. I know that it's easy to kind of have these sound bites where we say, Palestine is not a Muslim issue. And you say that because there's Palestinians who are Christians, and you say that because there are Palestinians who are Jews, and you say that because there's Palestinians who are non-religious. And I understand why you're saying that. But what you are also minimizing by that is the importance that Palestine holds for Muslims. It does matter. And so while Palestine is not exclusively a Muslim issue, it's a lot of issues. It's a humanitarian issue. It's a racism issue. It's a ethnic colonial issue. It is a issue that applies to all things, but you cannot separate it. It's a Christian issue. It's all of these issues, but you cannot separate it from the fact too. There's a reason the Muslim Student Association, the SJP, are doing this event right now. And because there is a lot of shared interest on the Palestinian issue. That's number one. Coalition building is important because the same way that the Israeli government has attempted to separate Palestinians from one another in terms of their communities, in terms of their roads, in terms of making sure Gaza and the West Bank are so inaccessible to each other that no one knows, the struggles of the individual person. It is important for you to find people on your campus who are like-minded, who care about these issues, and build with them. And the reason that it is important is because you're so much more vulnerable individually. I'm happy to see MSA and SJP unequivocally working together, because it wasn't always like that. SJP used to be considered an organization that was terrifying to work with because you were going to be blacklisted, or you're going to be blackballed, or no one would want to hire you, or all of these types of things. I'm a victim of that system myself. And I knew that there were organizations who cared and who wanted to, but were afraid. The fear only works if you're isolated. And the fear only works if no one's standing next to you on these types of things. I'm not going to call them out because I don't want to give them importance, but certain groups that attempt to blacklist Palestinians or those who fight for Palestinian liberation do not work if there are too many of us to put on there. It doesn't work. It doesn't work if all of us are on there. It doesn't make any difference. And people are starting to see through the illegitimacy of these arguments. Leveling anti-Semitism as a concept on Palestinians or those who care about Palestinian rights as an attempt to distract is the most disingenuous thing you can do to try to force that conversation change. We already know that fighting for Palestinian rights and Palestinian liberation is not an anti-Semitic thing. We already know that. We don't need to keep defending that, because anyone who's trying to force you to speak about anti-Semitism instead of Palestinian liberation or instead of your right to exist is not engaging with you in good faith. They're just not. We already know it's a blanket statement. We don't even have to say, I'm pretty sure the SJP Constitution, when I was president, had it in there. We don't condone any forms of anti-Semitism or anti-racism or anti-anything. We don't, because that's not what Palestinians or the Palestinian cause is about. And so I'm urging you to work within your communities, because there's no point at all outside of college when you are going to have this much time, this much energy, and this much freedom and lack of responsibility objectively. This is the best time for you to do this type of work. And the reason I'm saying that it's the best time for you to do this type of work is because I am 27 years old. I'm not in college anymore, and I'm still attending SJP events. I'm still attending SJP rallies. I'm still attending these types of things because we're able to support in the way that we can, but it only works if the people on the ground while you're in college are building up these institutions. And so I really do appreciate the fact that you guys are doing that. I'm
gonna do action items, but I'm gonna make a comment really quickly.
Yeah.
I think while you're working, especially, I think this is more targeted to MSA specifically. You need to be intentional and thoughtful about what organizations you're working with and who you're willing to build relationships with. There's a drive for religious organizations like MSA to focus on interfaith activities and outreach. And I consider one of my biggest regrets, in literally in life, actually, like you could tell me in 20 or 30 years, and I'll probably say one of my top 10 regrets is that I helped put together an interfaith event with an organization. And granted, like we had a discussion about what could be and could not be discussed. I'm not going to give them airtime, so I'm not going to say their name, but we can if you guys want. Where I wanted to focus on interfaith. And I felt like it could be separate from all of the other political activities that they were doing on campus, specifically towards Palestinians. It's one thing to focus on relationship building. It's one thing to focus on education, spread awareness about your organization, your religion, issues that matter to you, whatever the case is. But our faith, I'm speaking to Muslims right now, and this might be relevant to others, there are values that you hold. There's a standard you hold to yourself. There's a respect that you have for yourself and other people. Do not lower yourself for someone to just acknowledge you and acknowledge your humanity. It is not worth your time. Focus your energy on building with people who care for you, respect you, trust you, come in good faith. Just be very intentional about who you work with and who you put your name with. So I'll say that. In terms of action items, I will be brief because I think they're very clear cut. Number one, I've said this so many times, educate yourself. There's so much to learn. There's too much to learn. You need to know. So that way you can speak to it. You can take the burden off of Palestinians. If you're Palestinian, so you can speak, you can add another level to an emotional argument that you can inherently make. You just need to know. Number two, you need to bring awareness. And that is what you are all doing on the streets of High Street. I'm so proud of you. You are bringing awareness to this issue and you need to keep doing so. And there are a multitude of ways to do so. There are protests, there are rallies, there are educational events you can do on campus. I know it's really hard right now with COVID, but I would actually challenge, I know there are people who are in MSA here. There might be some people that are outside of MSA. You should work with SJP. You guys should work with them on their educational events, whether now in the summer, in the fall, when you're back in campus. But you need to work on bringing awareness to all that you're learning and what's happening. Number three, it's kind of like this lobbying, this political component to things. You need to do, call-ins, what do you call it? Telephone banking for, Congress people like Joyce Beatty and Sherrod Brown. You need to be doing these types of things, local, state level, federal level, politicians. You need to be doing,
you need to be doing the work.
Do the work. And you guys can set up these telephone banking events. I would challenge you all right now, like if you're an MSA member, like is there not one person who's like, I will work with SJP to put together a telephone banking event? You create a
letter
script,
writing.
letter writing. Oh my God.
They have, you can literally fill in the blanks. Like it's not, there's texts even. I think it's like PLFZND or something to 504. I mean, don't quote me on that, but it's some conglomerate of numbers and letters, and it fills things out for you. You have to be active.
That was number 3. And then number 4 is BDS.
Absolutely.
Palestinian civil society has told us exactly what to do that will help them. Granted, like you can give funds to obviously like hospitals in very specific instances, of course, but they are asking you to stand with them to affect the capital of the state of Israel.
Absolutely.
Like that is what they did in South Africa, and it worked in South Africa. And Palestinians are telling you, help us get these businesses to stop illegally operating in the West Bank, stop trading and working with the Israeli government or Israeli institutions. It is a very clear call. Like it's simple. You do BDS. And I know that SJP on campus has worked through the BDS movement in the past and has been shut down by USG consistently. Absolutely. But I would challenge you all. I know for a fact that they will be working on BDS this upcoming year. You must stand with them. You go to their events, you spread awareness about it, you work with them to get signatures, you stand with them at USG hearings or I don't know what they call them, but trials, events, things like that. You speak to your USG representatives. They represent you. Like there is a representative of USG for commuter students, for Fisher students, for, I don't know all the majors and things like that, but regardless, like they are there to represent you. You are their constituents. Yeah. They should do what you want.
And that's the thing, OSU has ties to Israeli products and institutional support through the university. And I know that the BDS call out for OSU has been very, very consistent. But the problem is that USG has consistently, and as recent as 2018, said that the implication of a resolution would negatively impact students on campus and opportunities for scholarships. And that it stands against academic freedom. And they were concerned about the exclusionary language. All of those things together, think about where they're coming from. Are we more concerned about the implications of this resolution, how they would negatively impact students? Well, if the students are calling for this, how are they negatively impacting students? If you're saying that the language is exclusionary, you're by and large assuming that people who are calling for Palestinian liberation or calling for the to stop funding Israeli products and settlers as people who are exclusionary. You're not going to make a lot of friends doing something like this. And I understand that it can be scary for people, but it's right. And it's the only, again, you cannot use anti-Semitism as a threat or as a shield when we know we're not anti-Semitic.
And also I believe, if I'm correct in this, someone correct me if I'm not, BDS on campus is actually not only inclusive like this Palestinian, statehood, liberation movement. It also includes like stopping business with companies that are complicit in like the prison industrial complex. Like it is expansive. OSU's SJP has been so inclusive of so many issues and so many different people's liberation. And so again, if you are looking for something to do not pity them, stand with them. And there's a very clear way for you all to stand with Palestinians on the ground. BDS. So
and
again,
go to bdsmovement.net.
Yeah.
As the primary source for that. And then I'm seeing a lot of people talk about general information. Decolonizepalestine.com is a phenomenal source. It has a section about essentially myth busting. It has a section about on the ground education that you would need, history, everything. Like I would start there.
Yeah, but education, awareness, political lobbying, I don't know what you want to call it, and then BDS. And with that, also, I believe they're going to send a link to the recording. I'm like reading through the messages. In addition to that, we might send some resources to MSA or SJP. So when they send out the link, they can also include some resources for you all if you'd like to continue educating yourself or getting involved. We're going to have Q&A.
And you can also contact, I can't speak for Haroun, but you can contact me individually. If you have any questions, I'll try to be the best help that I can. I do immigration law. So if any, shout out anyone's trying to go in that route. But this is about community building. This is about making sure that we are arming ourselves intellectually in the best way that we possibly can. And I appreciate honestly, more than you guys know, the fact that you're here, the fact that you're listening, and the fact that you're willing to take action moving forward. This is really, really important. But we're ready for questions.
Yeah, if you need to drop because of the time limit, like feel free to drop at any point. We'll stay on for a little bit.
4 o'clock pretty
know, exactly. And yeah, thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk to you all and like get involved with the groups that we were so involved with back in the day.
Yeah.
This is awkward. I don't know how you guys are doing questions.
Q&A?
KD, come on, President.
I think that we can just leave it open. If someone is speaking though, just send it to the chat. But whatever you guys have, you guys can ask. I'll end the recording so that people do feel comfortable.
Yeah, please do.